of Literature and Public Humanities.
Oh, Seema, you've gone on to mute accidentally.
This session will be chaired by none other than the wind beneath our wings, Fulbright scholar, academic par excellence, chief editor Rupkatha, Professor Tirtho Prasad Mukhopadhyay, who is a titan in the field of visual and cognitive anthropology, design education, psycholinguistics, art research, literary theory, Indology, and theology. At present, Professor Mukhopadhyay graces the Department of Digital Art e Impresa, University of Guanajuato, Mexico. We welcome you, sir, and request you to kindly take over the proceedings and formally introduce our plenary speaker. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Seema. It's always wonderful to be introduced by you and into the sessions. And Professor Dilon, it is a privilege for us that you are here today, and you would be able to share with us your enormous amount of experience with what you call the kind of deictic experiences that is so relevant for media studies, and we are all in an age of the neo media, and we are getting to rediscover the past in ways in which it wouldn't have been possible before. And I believe that we are headed into a wonderful final session, to cap it all, the 3-day conference, where we had more than participants from 21 countries all over the world, from Africa to Asia, to all the corners of the world. And after Professor Dilon's session, of course, we will start the new Latin America segment of Rupkatha, which will be conducted entirely in Spanish. Of course, that will be another feather to our cap, but there couldn't have been a better way to conclude our academic exercise for this year's Rupkatha conference. Let me first introduce Professor Sara Dilon to all of you here. And it is a pleasure to invite her and that she's here with us. She, from the information that I gathered from the internet, from the Cambridge website, she seemed to have joined the Cambridge Faculty of English in 2014. And she now teaches as Professor of Literature and the Public Humanities from 2021. So I guess you are now teaching as professor at Cambridge. She has been the general editor of the book series Glyphy, Contemporary Writers, Critical Essays. And Professor Dilon serves on the editorial boards of C21, Journal of 21st Century Writing, and Fantastica. I have been looking at the pages of some of these journals as they are available on the internet, a wide panorama of interest in media. And I'm sure Professor Dilon will share all those aspects of experience with us here today. She's the most important thing, however, I think, is that she's associated with Arts and Humanities Research Council of BBC Radio 3, New Generation Thinkers. And Professor Dilon also broadcasts regularly on BBC Radio 3 and Radio 4. And so this took me to the BBC radio page, and I found that you could actually log into that page. You could become a member and listen to the BBC broadcasts. I'm going to put it down on the chat, the conversations of this Zoom. So just to share that BBC link with you for Radio 3. I guess Professor Dilon will be able to give us some guidelines regarding how or when we could access BBC Three radio network to listen more to her and to other nice programs, which is of interest to all scholars of humanities. And finally, I would like to state that today she is pursuing the idea of humanities as a deictic practice, deictic or indexical practice, an index, and I'm so interested in indexicality, and I hope to listen to her and to be illuminated on her perspectives on indexicality. And she would like to reflect on what it might mean to think about the humanities in this way and how it enables a new theorization of interdisciplinarity and of the humanities' engagement with and inaction of it. So the paper explores the idea basically of deixis. And without much ado, without much confusion, I would like to invite Professor Dilon to talk to us. Professor Dilon, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that very kind and warm welcome. I want to start with an apology. I always think it's very poor form to just sort of appear at a conference towards its closing, but unfortunately the invitation clashed with my family holiday. So I have been away for the last few days and have only just been able to join you, but I've had a look at the programme and it just looks phenomenal. And you've covered so many things, the Anthropocene, animal studies, history, you know, as you said, focus on Indian literature, African studies, and lots of kind of practice-based papers. So I'm really disappointed to have missed it, but I hope you're all on a high after a really productive few days. So I decided, and maybe this was the wrong call listening to the introduction, to give quite a theoretical paper actually. So it's drawing off all the experiences I've had over my career of interdisciplinary working, which I'd got to the point of feeling like that there wasn't a sufficiently robust theoretical framework to account for and explain all the ways in which interdisciplinarity can happen. So this is a working paper that's attempting to start to build that framework. And what I'll try and do without making it overlong is just drop in a few moments as I go, connecting the different theories with some of the experiences that I've had. And I know we've got a little bit of time for questions at the end. So I think I'll just jump in. I do need to share my screen, so hold on a minute while I get that sorted and get the slideshow up, which is not doing at the moment. Hold on. Right, is that good? Can you see the slideshow? Yeah, thumbs up from someone. Yeah. Cool, yes. Lovely. Okay, lovely. So brownie points, if anyone knows what we're looking at, you can pop it in the chat if you want. But I'm going to start here. I'm going to start in the Vatican, in the walls of the Stanza della Signatura, and apologies for my Italian accent, the room of the Signatura in English, which in the Vatican are adorned with some of Renaissance painter Raphael's most famous frescoes. Now, whilst the room takes its name from the highest court of the Holy See, which met in the room in the mid-16th century, its original function was as Pope Julius II's library. So a room that literally houses knowledge from, you know, a whole range of disciplines and is the physical site of study and of learning. And the frescoes that adorn the four walls and the ceiling of the room might be read as a Renaissance testament to, in fact, a celebration of what we now think of as interdisciplinarity. That is, to the mutual importance of different ways of knowing and understanding the world. So in this context, for the Renaissance painters, it's theology, literature, philosophy, and jurisprudence. So supernatural truth is illustrated in the disputation of the Most Holy Sacrament, which is that one, sorry. Beauty is represented in the Parnassus with Apollo and the Muses. Good is expressed in the cardinal and theological virtues and the law. And then rational truth is illustrated in this one, the School of Athens. The allegorical figures of theology, poetry, philosophy, and justice, which adorn the ceiling, correspond to the faculties of the spirits that are painted on the walls. And I want to rest for a moment in this room, and it's quite delightful actually that you can in fact literally do so, or virtually do so, on the Vatican website. You can go and sit in there and look around. And I want us to contemplate for a moment this fresco, the School of Athens. So it's an appropriate place to begin some thoughts, or end your thoughts on interdisciplinarity, because the painting has come to symbolize the marriage of art, philosophy and science that was the hallmark of the Italian Renaissance. And I'm sure there's people here who are much more specialist in art history than I am, so I'm practicing interdisciplinarity as we speak. This is not my discipline, but I'll do my best. It was painted between 1509 and 1511, and it symbolizes philosophy, and it's situated opposite the disputa, which represents theology, and setting up then a contrast between religious and lay forms of knowledge. And you'll see at the center of the fresco stand two figures around which all the others are organized. On the left, as you look at the picture with his finger pointing to the sky, is Plato. And on his left, our right, is his student Aristotle, whose arm reaches out towards the viewer, palm down, flat on the ground. And both, you may be able to see, hold copies of books, their own books, in their hands. Plato has his Timaeus, and Aristotle has his Nicomachean Ethics. Though Aristotle's volume is sort of heavier and weightier, so he needs to give it a bit of support with his left thigh as well as holding it with his hand. But I want you to look at their right hands. So Plato points towards the heavens, whereas Aristotle's open gesture implies a grounding or a connectedness with the earth. So Plato and the thinkers gathered on his side of the fresco represent moral philosophy, and Aristotle and the thinkers on his side represent natural philosophy. So in our contemporary lexicon, we could roughly and very anachronistically say that Plato represents the humanities and Aristotle, to some extent, the natural sciences. Now, if we pursue this interpretation, then the fresco characterizes the humanities by this act of pointing, with the source or the object of knowledge being removed from the real world and found instead of the realm of abstract concepts and ideas. Here we might think of Plato's theory of forms. On the other hand, with his outstretched palm, Aristotle and the sciences are rooted in empiricism and the belief that knowledge comes from experience and is grounded on and studied the physical world. What I find most interesting in this depiction, however, isn't this stark contrast of the world of ideas versus the material world, and actually such a reductive division of knowledge and its sources and its methods between the humanities and the sciences is already complicated in the fresco. Because if you look towards the rear of the picture, there are two statues, and they're sort of set into alcoves. And the simple binarism of humanities versus science is challenged because on Plato's side, we find Apollo, who's representative of Aristotle's natural philosophy. And on Aristotle's side, we find the statue of Minerva, who's representative of Plato's moral philosophy. So already the image itself is challenging the binarism that it's setting up. But I want us to stay for the beginning of this paper with Plato's act of pointing. And as was so kindly mentioned in my introduction, this is where I want to think about what it might mean to characterize the humanities as deictic or indexical. And I'm using those terms synonymously in this paper. What does it mean to think about our methodologies as deictic? And how does that help us understand what we do and help us formulate these new theories of interdisciplinarity, which I have been looking for. And so that's where we're going to start. And we're going to think for a little bit about deixis, and then I'll offer you the beginnings of my taxonomy. And this is very much a work in progress. So as you'll see from the diagrams when we get to them, which have been very badly hand-drawn. So I welcome feedback from you all. So deixis. So deixis is pointing. Pointing is a deictic act, a demonstrative gesture, an act of indication or pointing out. And etymologically, it derives from the Greek, meaning able to show or showing directly. But here we move from art history to linguistics. Deixis is also a grammatical form, and it's one that poses, as Stephen C. Levinson notes, something of a problem for linguistics. I like this quote because linguistics is always usually, I find, quite dry, and this isn't. For those who treat language as a generative system for objectively describing the world, deixis is a big black fly in the ointment. Deixis introduces subjective, attentional, intentional, intentional, and of course, context-dependent properties into natural languages. So understanding the linguistic character of deixis as it occurs in natural languages provides, I think, a productive analogy for the knowledge practices and operations of the humanities disciplines. So for those who want to treat language as an objective description of an empirical world, deixis is a challenge, it's a problem, it's this big black fly. Because perhaps more so than any other grammatical form, it exposes that language doesn't function objectively. Rather, language is freighted with the subjective, with issues of attention, intention, and context. And I love these three words from Levinson. Moreover, deixis is in fact paradigmatic of all language in that respect. As Levinson notes, it's important to realize that the property of indexicality is not exhausted by the study of inherently indexical expressions. For just about any referring expression can be used deictically if accompanied by a gesture. So deitic expressions are semantically deficient. That is, the verbal act of pointing, of saying this, that, or there, means nothing if it's not accompanied by context and a physical act. So if I, for instance, in the old days when we could actually do this, was chairing an exam room and a student walked in and said, "Where am I sitting?" And I said, "You're sitting there," but I didn't point. They would have no idea which chair they were actually meant to take up. So the verbal requires the context, there, that chair, and the physical act of showing. Deixis's meaning making then relies on a combination of both indexicality and hermeneutics. It's never a mere act of pointing, but an act of pointing that requires attention to space, time, and gesture in order for it to make sense. Another final quote for Levinson, or there might be another one. He says, indexicality is both an intentional and attentional phenomenon concentrated around the spatio-temporal center of verbal interaction. And we might understand the humanities then as deictic in this sense. The humanities are engaged in an indexical practice. We point at things. And I got the idea for this paper at a history conference where lots of people were just pointing at things. And I was trying to figure out why that was of value in and of itself. We point at things, but this pointing is never merely just a pointing. It's also a hermeneutical pointing. That is, the humanities are a deictic form of sense-making in which indexicality makes sense only by drawing attention to the spatio-temporal context, both of the one doing the pointing, that's us, and by drawing attention to the spatio-temporal context of what you're pointing at. And the deictic humanities then are intentional and attentional. Their meaning making is irreducibly attached to the spatio-temporal sites of the object or phenomenon being pointed at, so that's what we're studying, the pointer, the situation of the humanities scholar, and here there's an aspect of the paper to be developed about the way in which thinking about the deictic humanities is a way of thinking about the decolonization of the humanities that's been happening very much, at least in the UK and the US over the past few years. So reflecting on the spatio-temporal site of the pointer and of the interlocutor, who you're pointing for or why you're pointing. So one interesting consequence, I think, of this theory of the humanities is its reframing of the question of the truth of the knowledge it produces. And this is something I'm very interested in, the kind of validity or rigor or robustness of humanities knowledge. And again, I think this is the last one from oh, my PowerPoint seems to have stopped. Let's see if that works. There we go.
Yeah. I just raised my hand to remind you that the PowerPoint is not moving forward.
Yeah,
Maybe.
that's all right. I think we're on the right quote now. You got any sentence? Is that how it starts?
Right. Yes,
yeah.
we did.
Cool. So Levinson says any sentence with indexicals cannot directly express a proposition, for on any doctrine a proposition is an abstract entity whose truth value is independent of the time, places and persons in the speech event. So there's one way of reading this, which is that the humanities can never produce knowledge that's true because we can never produce knowledge that's independent of the time, place and persons of our study. Or there's a different way of thinking about it, which is that the truth value of the knowledge produced by the deictic humanities is always dependent on the time, place and persons of the scholarly event. And this is where thinking about the deictic humanities links up with a lot of work in science and technology studies that's happened over the past few decades about the subjectivity of both humanities and scientific knowledge. So there's another kind of hyperlink to that body of work as well. Right, so that's sort of setting up very quickly an idea of what it might mean to think of the humanities as deictic. And now I want to move on to then thinking about interdisciplinarities, and I'm using that in the plural on purpose. So to engage in interdisciplinarity, the humanities, I don't think, has to fundamentally alter its methodology. And this is some concerns that my colleagues have, that we have to kind of abandon what we do and why we do it, how we do it, if we're going to be interdisciplinary. It doesn't have to be to do that. It doesn't have to abandon deixis. Rather, since deixis makes meaning through the dynamical coexistence of the indexical act and the spatio-temporal context, the meaning making of the deictic humanities can be altered, new meanings can be created, not by changing the act of pointing, but by changing the spatio-temporal context. So the context can be altered by changing either what's being pointed at, so you're pointing at objects which might not ordinarily be the province of the humanities, or you're changing where you're pointing, or when one's engaging in the act of pointing, and who you're pointing with. So changing all these different moving parts of the spatio-temporal context of the deictic act is, for me, what produces interdisciplinarity, or more properly interdisciplinarities. Since depending on which category of the spatio-temporal context you change, you're going to have a different type of interdisciplinarity. And these are the types of interdisciplinarity that I want to start by proposing to you. I've got 3 at the moment. That might change, but we'll see. We'll see how they go. And there's a nice essay from 2004 by Kathy Davidson and David Goldberg called Engaging the Humanities, where they say that disciplinarity is an institutional creation forged out of specific contexts of space and time. And so if you adapt that, then interdisciplinarity is produced by the alteration of those contexts of space and time. So my 3...
For that, sorry to interrupt.
I haven't got, I don't think, no, I haven't got a quote for that. I can pop it in the chat later for you. It's an essay called Engaging the Humanities, 2004, Davidson and Goldberg. So the first type of interdisciplinarity I want to suggest, and this is also riffing off Davidson and Goldberg a little bit, is what I'm calling synchronic interdisciplinarity. So Davidson and Goldberg identify, I think, this first form of interdisciplinarity, which is created by an alteration to that which is pointed at. It's a form of interdisciplinarity where objects of analysis are socially, culturally chosen, problem or issue based. And I think you can go further back than Davidson and Goldberg for this type of interdisciplinarity, actually back to Roland Barthes in 1977. This is From Work to Text. I'm not going to read this very long quote. You can peruse it at your leisure. It's a quote I've used, I discovered during my PhD, and I've come back to again and again. But what Barthes is saying here is that interdisciplinary happens when a range of disciplines come together to study an object or a subject of knowledge that doesn't belong to any of them. So to give you a practical example of this, I've been running for the last year and a bit a Mellon seminar on the history of AI, where we've looked at AI, but we've had people from a whole different range of disciplines: actual scientists, computer scientists, historians, literary scholars, critical theorists, activists. So we've gone even outside of academia. So if you imagine that AI is the object of study in the middle, and I have a very bad drawing here. So this is synchronic interdisciplinarity. AI is the object of study in the middle in this example, and D is all the disciplines which bring their knowledges and their approaches to bear on that object of study. So I'm calling that synchronic interdisciplinarity, where a number of different disciplinary perspectives and methodologies coexist with each other in relation to a common object of inquiry. And in synchronic interdisciplinarity, the multiple acts of attention from across these disciplines cumulatively produce new knowledge about the object under scrutiny, even though those disciplines may not then in fact be in any way in dialogue with each other. So there's no arrows connecting the Ds there. So they may in fact not interact with each other in any way at all, although of course they do to some extent in practice. So, but in theory, disciplines do not have to be altered by direct interaction with each other, but the change in object of attention from the norm of any one discipline. So rather than studying a literary text, you'd study something like climate change or AI. The change in the object from the norm of any one discipline can then exert back probably along these lines, an adaptive or disruptive influence on the disciplines that are coming to bear on it. So you might have an arrow at the other end of this line as well, which is studying that object changes what you think about what your discipline is and what it can do. So that's the first one with an example of how I've put that into practice. The second type, and this diagram's even worse, I think, and I really do want to change this one, is synthetic interdisciplinarity. So if synchronic interdisciplinarity is characterized by, you remember, these multiple perspectives on a new object, which is the provenance of no one discipline, a new knowledge is produced at the site of the object rather than necessarily at the site of the discipline. In synthetic interdisciplinarity, this arises not through a change of the object of study, so it would stay, that O at the bottom might stay a literary text, it might stay Shakespeare or something in English studies, but the change happens by the bringing of multiple disciplines to bear on that object. So rather than just studying Shakespeare with the tools of literary studies, you would also study it with cognitive psychology, or you'd study it with digital humanities, or you'd study it with history. So you bring multiple disciplines to bear on that object. Now, this one is, whereas synchronic interdisciplinarity, this one is, in my experience, a collective enterprise involving more than one individual. Synthetic interdisciplinarity is, or can be, an individual enterprise involving more than one discipline, but deployed by one person. So in synthetic interdisciplinarity, an individual brings multiple disciplinary perspectives to bear on an object of his or her choosing, most commonly one cited already within their own discipline. And the aims are similar to that of synchronic interdisciplinarity. You want to bring multiple perspectives to bear on an object of inquiry, but I think it's different in its structure and its effects, because in this form of interdisciplinarity, the individual and the object are to some extent co-located. And this is why I've sort of tried to do it as a kind of hand pointing down, but I actually wonder whether the D's need to be inside the O, inside the object. And what you're doing is you're bringing all these different disciplinary perspectives in to bear. And as a result, those disciplinary perspectives do start to be in dialogue with each other. They do start to interact in very interesting ways. And so the location of existing disciplines is changed. They are taken from their homes and they are deployed in a new context. And one example of doing this in my own work is my new book is coming out in a few months called Story Listening. I read across many disciplines on the functions of stories, from anthropology to psychology to philosophy to literary studies and beyond, in order to construct a sort of also a taxonomy of the functions of stories. So the story was the object of knowledge, but I had to read and master to some extent a whole range of disciplines in order to get an interdisciplinary perspective of theories of the functions of stories. And doing that is an absolutely fascinating exercise. It does take time. Synthetic interdisciplinarity offers a way of thinking differently and valuing differently the traditional distinction between a specialist and a generalist. And this is just a little sideline before we go on to the last taxonomy. This distinction is determined by the object of study, usually. So specialists know one object of study in depth, and generalists know many objects of study in less depth. Practical example of this, the best generalists I've ever met are BBC radio producers. They are phenomenally erudite across a massive range of subjects. But as soon as they've made the programme, they move on and they learn something new. They are not specialists, and that's why they rely on academics to come and offer the specialist knowledge. But the synthetic interdisciplinarian, and here I think is an important distinction, is not a generalist. So their object of study, or my object of study, when thinking about my book, remains in the provenance of my discipline, stories, but I range more widely within that discipline than others and bring a range of approaches to bear on understanding this object of study in greater depths. So in this sense, the synthetic interdisciplinarian is perhaps more surprisingly akin to Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog than to his fox. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about at this point, Isaiah Berlin wrote a wonderful essay on the fox and the hedgehog, which is an essay that speaks to interdisciplinarity in very famous ways. And Berlin opens his essay by citing the Greek poet Archilochus's fragment. And the fragment is, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And it might be natural to assume then an alignment between interdisciplinarity and the fox who knows many things, a centrifugal thinker who pursues many ends. But actually, I think that the synthetic interdisciplinarians' activities are centripetal, like the hedgehogs, with the difference being that multiple perspectives are brought to bear, not on one single universal principle in Berlin's essay, but in relation to a circumscribed range of objects of study. So synthetic interdisciplinarity is not a form of pragmatism. It's not a paying deference, and this is from Davidson and Goldberg, at least in principle, only to the revelation of the object of analysis, since it can equally be speculative or theoretical. But Davidson and Goldberg in their discussion are right in raising the question of respect, because synthetic interdisciplinarity requires a certain amount of audacity. You have to step outside of your own training and your own comfortable areas of knowledge. But in doing so, you have to be guided by a rigorous commitment to the revelation of knowledge about the object, rather than circumscribed by a courteous regard for internal disciplinary niceties, at the same time as going deep enough into disciplines to know that you're getting stuff right. And that's where peer review is really, really helpful. Right, so the last form of interdisciplinarity I'm going to suggest is called locative interdisciplinarity, and you'll see why, because it's about a certain form of movement. And this form of interdisciplinarity is created by changing the where and the when of the pointer and the act of pointing, not by changing the object of study or the disciplines being deployed. So in this form, the object of attention, O, again, might not be changed significantly from the norm of your discipline, but the context, and nor in fact might your disciplinary methodology, the D, but the context in which you're performing that act is radically changed. So you could have context A, which is your research seminar in your department where you're very safely and comfortably within your discipline, or there could be context B, where you're making a radio program about Lord of the Flies, let's say, William Golding's, because that's one I've made. And that's the locative element. And this change of location can be proximal. So A to B could be your department faculty seminar to your School of Arts and Humanities seminar. So, you're going a little bit further afield, but not too far. Or it could be distal. So you're going entirely out of the academy. You're enacting one's work within a public or a policy or an industry context. And this shift can also be geopolitical, which is again where I think the locative interdisciplinarity to some extent aligns with, and I need to think about this more, as I said, the Anglo-American decolonizing agenda, because you can shift the location from that of the Anglo-American imaginary. And what happens when you look at the same object of knowledge with similar methodologies, but in a totally different context? Or does that necessarily then change both your object of knowledge and your methodologies? And I'm very interested in both how these structures hold and also then how they're challenged when these things move around. So Davidson and Goldberg, again, I hadn't remembered that I'd quoted from them so much, so I will put the reference in the chat, sorry about that. They observe that if culture is the traditional site of the humanities is traditionally conceived restricted culture to its national delimitations, and locative interdisciplinarity is one way of challenging that national delimitation. So locative interdisciplinarity produces new forms of knowledge because of the effect of the change of time and space of the act of pointing and the change that has on the meaning making. And the change of interlocutor that shifts this, so the change of interlocutor that the shifted spatio-temporal context creates. So this is where who you're pointing for comes into play, because you could be pointing for your fellow specialist, or you could be pointing for a Radio 4 listener, which is a very different interlocutor. So the change of interlocutor that happens from A to B can introduce a radically unanticipated, I've experienced, reinterpretation of one's deictic act. So reinterpretation of one's methodologies, how one understands knowledge to be produced and why it's relevant. And locative interdisciplinarity then, I think, more than the other forms, requires methodological flexibility and can effect a change to the methodological act itself. So for example, and these are terms that I've developed through my BBC work, but also through working with Claire Craig on the new book, who was a scientist by training and then a civil servant and then headed the Government Office for Science, so not a humanist in any way whatsoever. Locative interdisciplinarity requires at the least what I call lexical flexibility. So you have to be able to adapt your language, the language in which one frames one's knowledge, and recognize that other people have different languages and use the same word to mean different things. So you have to be very flexible, and you have to have value flexibility. And value flexibility is what I'm defining as a contextually mandated reassessment of disciplinary local judgments regarding proper forms of knowledge production, dissemination, and application. So you cannot walk into a BBC studio and take the values of academic literary studies because you would produce awful radio programmes. Likewise, you can't walk into the Cambridge Faculty of English with the values of a BBC radio producer because you'd produce awful scholarship. So you have to recognize that context A and context B require a flexibility of what counts as, you know, excellence, and a recognition, a certain modesty that what you consider excellence in your context might not be anywhere near the same as what's considered excellence in a different context. So effective locative interdisciplinarity, which also could be called transsectorality or intersectorality, but I think they're really ugly words, must be guided by another idea I'm working on, which is an ethics of compromise. And I think we could all do with a bit more ethics of compromise around the world at the moment. Right, so to finish then, in another good essay, and I'll put this one in the chat as well, called Disciplining the Interdisciplinary, Radicalism and the Academic Curriculum from 2001, Elizabeth Bird illuminates how the emergence in the UK and the US, and apologies for my Anglo-Western focus, that's what I know. So this is a study of the emergence in the UK and the US of interdisciplinary sites of research and pedagogy. And Bird identifies that this happened in the 1970s, and it happened because of, or in line with, or as part of a radical critique of the way in which knowledge was organized in the academy. And this historical context of emergence aligns interdisciplinarity with the radical politics of the late 20th century, with the civil rights movements, with feminism, with Marxism, and its challenge to the perceived conservatism of universities and their disciplinary structures. In the 21st century, I think the deictic humanities and the interdisciplinarities to which they can lead, synchronic, synthetic, and locative, are characterized by a different politics of engagement. So the theories presented here are not intended to dismantle existing disciplines, nor the institutions in which they are housed. These interdisciplinaries cannot happen without established disciplines. They are not antagonistic, but supplementary to them. But if, as Tony Betcher proposes in his book, Academic Tribes and Territories, disciplines continue to be best understood as such, as tribes and territories, then the governing principles of those spaces need to shift from defense to engagement. Tribes and territories are not enriched by building walls and patrolling boundaries, but by supporting and encouraging, and you can tell that some of this was written in the light of Brexit in the UK, by supporting and encouraging the free movement of people and ideas. Interdisciplinarians are not traitors nor spies, but diplomats. Occasionally they become immigrants, but more commonly interdisciplinarians remain aligned with their discipline of origin, to which they continue to contribute and for which they serve as advocates. Interdisciplinarians are not, as I've said, nomadic generalists, but they do travel beyond the confines of the tribe. And for that reason, I think their work must be supported, not by attack, which I have experienced, but by the generosity of diplomatic immunity.
Thank you, Professor Dilon, for that excellent presentation. We have overshot time.
Oh,
but
sorry.
but it doesn't matter. We can crunch a little bit down on the valedictory session, and would really love to accommodate this this the academic part of the discussions, and especially your references to Deixis. I guess what I gather from your idea of Deixis and in Indexicality is that these are powerful tools to the hands of the uh, new new media person, to the new human being. And it is also showing me a path out of the general overarching experiential discourse of language that has dominated the academy in the last century. And the Deixis is also, I guess, in a sense, it's very emotive, because it's for that moment, and it's creating an impact, and which is creating experience rather than absorbing experience from the past. Um, but mm, so there's I would just ask you one question and then invite open this forum out for other questions. My question is in relation to cutting of plants, like as you say that the interdisciplinary scholar is not a nomad, is uh, she has to be respected, and she is evolving in the context of other cultures, other disciplines, other discourses. And how far do you think would an interdisciplinary scholar would have to evolve in order to communicate with uh, the community in which she finds herself in, culturally
That's a good.
or socially, or
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, to rephrase it slightly, not how much would they need to, but how much would they be willing and able to. And I think that is that's the more important point. So you can go as far as you are able to. So there's a chapter of the book where I use a lot of analytic philosophy on scientific representation and modeling. And I do have a background in analytic philosophy, and found myself becoming absorbed in the disciplinary debates. And I actually had to withdraw from that in order to focus on my task at hand, which was how could I construct a theory of stories as narrative models, based on philosophical arguments about how models represent. So I think it's a case of how far do you go to get what you need respectfully, but not get absorbed, but also what might happen if you do get absorbed. Like, do you have the time or the space or the adventurousness or the capacity to get absorbed, and to see what happens and then come back again. There's a wonderful science fiction story, actually, I don't know if any of you know it, Naomi Mitchison's Memoirs of a Space Woman, which is a little novella. That's a wonderful novella, and it's about the main character is a communicator. So it's a early backlash against the kind of imperialism of American space opera, like Star Trek and Star Wars, and it's about what happens when you encounter worlds that are different to your own, and don't try and dominate them or suppress them or change them. And so she has to go and become absorbed and communicate with the different alien species that she encounters on different planets. But the problem, of course, is that, of course, in doing so, she changes them and she herself becomes changed. So the story is very interested in kind of where the limits are. And in one instance, she changes so much that actually she becomes vulnerable to the same predators that the radial alien species is subject to, because it can't look up, and so she nearly gets killed. So there's a kind of warning there about becoming too absorbed, whilst also recognizing how much you can learn when you go in with an attitude of openness and engagement, not an attitude of domination or extraction.
Very well. I would, since we are already out of time, I would like to invite questions and any comments or observation. Yes. John, I see you raised arms. John Baker, Dr. Baker from Taiwan.
I do. Thank you. I want to say, forgive me for being so forward to raise my hand first and not deferring to others. I certainly meant to do that, but I want to thank you for the invitation, Professor. I do have a question. I think back to the early North American novels, Apocalypse Now, these things, going back. But the idea of going native. Going native, is that what I'm hearing in this description?
Not if it's going native as conceived in something like Heart of Darkness, which of course
Heart of Darkness.
Apocalypse
That's exactly
Now
where I was going.
adapted.
Forgive me for saying Apocalypse Now.
No, it's fine. I traced it back. It's fine. I saw that you had a panel on film at some point. Anyway,
Sleep has been optional this week.
No, and this is where I really need to think carefully about the using it as a shorthand, but the kind of post-colonial or decolonial connections of the paper, and that's it's a very short paper at the moment. It's going to be worked up, and I've learnt a lot about that over the last year running this History of AI seminar. We've had a lot of panels on decolonizing, on indigeneity, and I've read so much and learnt so much, so I need to absorb all that. But no, I think the point is the balance between respect for the knowledges and the disciplines, the knowledges and expertise of other disciplines. And I guess the question would be, can you then too easily map that onto different cultures or different sectors, which I'm doing a little bit at the end, but I'm wary that that's not a straight analogy. Me going and immersing myself in analytic philosophy is very different to me coming over to you guys in India and learning from you about your culture. Like that, you can't, I don't think you can simply map that. So that's something to think about, is how, but I do think there's something still to be gained by keeping the last category, by keeping the idea of the cross sector in with the idea of the interdisciplinarity, because I think they're separated out. I think we think about interdisciplinarity within an academic context, and then we think about going out and doing public work. And I don't think they're that different. I think they're different. They're on a scale. The question would be that where, if that same scale works for thinking about other forms of engagement and venturing out of your territories. And that's what I need to think about more. But thank you.
There's a postmodernist interpretation. It's a film of Heart of Darkness in the 1980s, I think. I got a clip of it when I was teaching the text. Can't find it anymore.
No.
But it might be interesting to look at. It's about a 15-minute clip, but it's quite interesting. Thank you so much for today. It was very. By the way, I love the frescoes.
Oh, they're beautiful. I'm gonna go in person at some point. But no, it's a really important question. Thank you for asking it, and it is something that happened during the writing of the paper that I hadn't thought about when I started it. So it is something I need to push at, but thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, John's questions makes me wonder if there is not an inescapable element in that didactic transformation that we are seeking. But anyways, now let me go on to Dr. Himadri Lahiri, Professor, University of Burdwan, India, for the last quick question and a quick response from Professor Dilon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dilon, for your fascinating lecture. I was thinking, because I got many insights from your lecture, I was, in fact, I used to think that interdisciplinarity basically implies a certain kind of immersive process. One gets into other areas and gets much knowledge about that, and then applies that kind of knowledge and insight to a particular text or object or something like that. Now, there is another technical word, which is multidisciplinarity. So how would you differentiate between these two terms, interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity? And in this connection, I was reminded of James Clifford's interpretation of the word travel theory, which means that he says that going out of the village going out of one's own place, going to other places and gather knowledge and coming back again. So how do you how do you integrate or how do you interpret your explanation from the point of view of these two observations? Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. I take the second one first because I think that speaks to John's question to some extent as well, which is something that I hadn't thought about enough, which is the idea of travel and movement. I think so I think I kind of say I'm going to think more about that one, but thank you. The first one, multidisciplinarity, I don't like the word, and I don't find it operative in any useful way as opposed to interdisciplinarity. And I might just not have read enough yet around the topic, which is part of the job of working up this paper. But you know, we only need one. I think we only need one word. We just need to think about different types of that word, which is why I chose interdisciplinarity. But I guess your idea of going and learning lots of disciplines and bringing back, that would be my second type of interdisciplinarity. But that's not the first one. That's not many disciplines gathering around one object of knowledge. And I wouldn't want to say that one of them is multidisciplinarity and one of them is interdisciplinarity. Again, I think it's a scale, and I think they're different types of it. But if I read more or people send me references and multidisciplinarity comes to seem useful, then I will have lexical flexibility and I will see if I can adapt it. But thank you. And what was the second one? Was Clifford, was it, you said, about travel?
Yes, please.
Lovely. I'll look that up. Thank you. And I'm excited now actually to work up that part of the paper. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I think we are already late for the next session, but we just cannot stop to think of or about interdisciplinarity, because we started the Rupkatha movement based on interdisciplinarity, and deeper and deeper that we have gone into interdisciplinarity, we realized that interdisciplinarity is the call of the future, and that we will look forward to Professor Dilon coming back to us and talking to us more and more about interdisciplinarity as she discovers more of interdisciplinary applications to our lives, to the hermeneutics of the culture, and to everything, really encompassing a theory of everything through interdisciplinarity. Thank you, Professor Dilon. I would now like to hand over the session back to Dr. Swayam Prabha. Once again, Dr. Swayam Prabha from Orissa, India, and she has been the communications executive for this entire conference, and would she like to invite Professor Lahiri and Professor Tarun Taposh Mukherjee, who is the editor, the managing editor of Rupkatha. If you please come forward for the final session. And Professor Dilon, I wouldn't like to hold you back from your day's work, for your evening's work, I guess, yes. And it's just beginning to dawn here in Mexico on the mysterious Sierra Madre Mountain.